The final collapse didn't come where anyone expected. Not in the frozen wasteland around Stalingrad. Not in the blood-soaked fields of Kursk. The death blow landed in the West. More than 500,000 German soldiers simply stopped fighting. They set down their weapons. They raised their hands. Their commander couldn't bear to witness it. He walked alone into the woods and ended his life with a single gunshot. How does the world's most feared military machine crumble overnight? The answer lies in something far more terrifying than defeat. It reveals a new form of warfare. War transformed into factory work. War reduced to clockwork precision. April 1945 brought the unthinkable. The Ruhr Valley had powered Hitler's war machine for years. Now it became a steel tomb. Dawn broke on April 18th to reveal a sight that defied belief. Veterans who had survived the Russian winter laid down their rifles. Men who had crawled through Normandy's hedgerows unbuckled their helmets. Hands rose to the sky in surrender. No final battle preceded this moment. No crushing assault broke their lines. They surrendered in complete silence. This wasn't ordinary defeat. Something far more chilling had occurred. The Americans hadn't simply outfought the Wehrmacht. They had unleashed something colder, something larger, an industrial machine that crushed more than flesh and metal. It destroyed the very will to resist. General Walter Model commanded Army Group B. He stared at maps that revealed a truth no German officer was prepared to face. 12 days. That's all the Americans needed. 12 days to encircle his entire force. American armor sealed the ring around 430,000 men. The pocket measured barely 50 miles across. Stalingrad had seen Germans fight to their last bullet. Falaise witnessed desperate breakout attempts. The Ruhr would see neither heroic charges nor suicidal attacks. Instead, soldiers who once believed they could outthink any enemy began emerging from their positions. White flags trembled in their hands. Firepower alone couldn't explain this collapse. The system was responsible. A new method of warfare that rendered courage meaningless. That made skill obsolete. That turned resistance into irrationality. Model later confessed his despair. The Americans don't fight battles. They run industrial operations. His men no longer faced another army. They confronted inevitability itself. April 4th marked the moment the trap snapped shut. Tanks from the U.S. Ninth Corps severed every road east of the Rhine. German radio operators sent desperate calls for orders. None arrived. Division commanders tried to shift positions. American artillery was already waiting for them. Reserve units attempted to move. Fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures. The vaunted Auftragstaktik doctrine became their executioner. Every maneuver triggered punishment. Every reaction was crushed before it began. A German sergeant later wrote about the hopelessness. Against the Russians, courage might save you. Against the Americans, courage just meant dying for nothing. The numbers grew impossible to believe. April 18th saw 317,000 men captured in just 2 weeks. April 21st brought the total past 500,000. Luftwaffe units surrendered. SS formations marched into prison camps. Paramilitary groups laid down their arms. The largest mass surrender in Western Front history unfolded in silence. Model faced only one choice remaining. He refused to sign surrender documents. A field marshal doesn't capitulate, he declared. Instead, he walked into the forest near Duisburg. A single pistol shot ended his life. His aide remembered those final words. "I cannot demand of my soldiers what I cannot do myself." His men had already chosen differently. They understood that bravery couldn't overcome a system designed to make bravery irrelevant. The Ruhr pocket became more than a battlefield that spring. It became a graveyard for an entire philosophy. The belief that willpower and skill alone determined victory died there. German soldiers once symbolized relentless determination. Now they discovered they weren't fighting men, or even armies. They faced a process, a machine. Warfare reduced to assembly lines and synchronized destruction. The 500,000 who surrendered at the Ruhr weren't cowards. They had been rendered obsolete. The Wehrmacht's collapse in the Ruhr didn't begin in April 1945. Its roots stretched back through years of victory. The very doctrine that carved lightning strikes across Europe became the steel cage that trapped them. Auftrags tactic meant mission command, a philosophy that transformed every German officer into an independent thinker. From field marshal to platoon leader, each understood the larger goal. Each possessed freedom to act without awaiting orders. 1939 saw this doctrine revealed to the world. 1940 witnessed it unleashed like a storm. French armies crumbled as German captains maneuvered faster than enemy generals could think. Soviet lines shattered under divisions that moved with supernatural speed and precision. The doctrine represented Germany's essence: flexibility, initiative, momentum. A German lieutenant could seize opportunities before American colonels received permission to move. Soldiers learned to think, not just obey. Squad leaders wielded autonomy that Allied company commanders could only dream of. Blitzkrieg succeeded because it transcended tanks and dive bombers. It was culture itself, an army that breathed speed, that fed on initiative, that won by outthinking enemies at every level. 5 years of victories followed this philosophy. Even when numbers turned against them, Germans believed tactical brilliance would balance the scales. Kasserine Pass proved this in February 1943. A handful of German units shredded green American divisions. Eisenhower himself reeled from the shock. The lesson burned itself into American consciousness. Courage and production meant nothing if squandered through clumsy doctrine. Germany made a fatal assumption. They believed war would always be decided by tactical duels, unit ingenuity against unit ingenuity. They assumed that sharper, faster, more disciplined soldiers could hold back America's tide of men and machines. They were catastrophically wrong. The Americans had no intention of fighting on German terms. From North Africa through Normandy, they absorbed each humiliation. Then they rebuilt themselves, not as a collection of brave soldiers, as a system, a learning machine, a synchronized machine that reduced initiative to irrelevance. By 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe operated within an industrial bloodstream. 26,000 tons of supplies pulsed through its veins daily. Ammunition, fuel, replacements, spare parts. A Sherman destroyed at noon was replaced by dawn. A platoon bled dry on Tuesday stood reinforced by Friday. German eyes saw sorcery. American command called it logistics. Firepower and fuel alone couldn't explain the Wehrmacht's collapse in the Ruhr. The Soviets wielded overwhelming material strength in the east. Yet German soldiers fought to the last round there, to the last street. What broke in the West wasn't supply lines. It was psychology. Americans had forged what German generals termed a material Schlacht, a battle of material. But the word missed the truth. This wasn't just weight of metal. It was predictability. It was inevitability. Every German decision triggered pre-calculated American responses. Artillery requests brought counter-battery fire within minutes. Reserve movements summoned fighter-bombers within the hour. Armor shifts triggered American columns appearing on flanks before German commanders realized breaches existed. Colonel General Alfred Jodl served as Chief of Operations at OKW. His March 1945 diary revealed the growing despair. Against the Americans, our doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that once served us now betrays us. Flexibility means nothing when the enemy anticipates every choice. Initiative means nothing when every action provokes overwhelming retaliation. We fight not a thinking mind, but a calculating machine. This revelation stalked every German officer as the Ruhr pocket closed. Auftrag's tactic had become their executioner. Their freedom of action was now liability. Their initiative was invitation to destruction. The Americans had shifted the battlefield itself. War was no longer a contest of wits or valor. It had become process, systematic, synchronized, relentless. German soldiers prepared for battles of skill and endurance. What they faced was a rolling factory of destruction, advancing on schedule, immune to heroism. Spring 1945 brought steel divisions of the Wehrmacht bracing for resistance. They were about to discover what it meant to fight not an army, but a system. The Ruhr was supposed to be impregnable. Army Group B dug in with precision, born from 5 brutal years of retreat. Divisions that had fought across Normandy, Italy, and the Eastern Front poured their remaining strength into mines, factories, and streets of concrete. Bridges carried explosive charges. Interlocking fields of fire covered every approach. German eyes saw an impregnable fortress. They believed Americans would bleed for every yard. But Americans didn't come to fight on German terms. They came to process the Ruhr like an assembly line. Germans prepared for battle. Americans delivered a system instead. The innovation was invisible at first. No superweapon appeared. No wonder tank rolled forward. Only synchronization, a doctrine Germans would whisper about as Krieg nach der Uhr. War by the clock. Every American move ticked against a timetable that had already calculated the next hours. April 5th at 0830 saw P-38 reconnaissance planes rise into morning haze. They flew grid patterns, silent hunters sketching the German world from above. Within hours, film strips dripped from dark rooms into intelligence officers' hands. They weren't searching for tanks or obvious troop concentrations. They mapped patterns, rhythms, the lifeblood of army movements. By late afternoon, American artillery wasn't firing at where German units stood. They targeted where those units would be 30 minutes later. Road junctions that looked safe at noon erupted in flames at 12:30. Convoys rerouted under cover of night found fighter bombers waiting at alternative crossroads. German officers described it with one word: unheimlich, uncanny. The enemy seemed to see the future. But it wasn't sorcery. It was system. Brigadier General Truman Forsyth served on Omar Bradley's staff. He called it the Red Ball System. Intelligence, armor, artillery, and logistics fused into one bloodstream. What one eye saw, every muscle struck. The Ruhr became the first place Americans unleashed it in full. Colonel Edwin Luther perfected the deadliest hammer in this arsenal. Time on target. No warning barrages. No scattered salvos. Dozens of batteries firing from hidden fields miles apart. Calculated so every shell landed in the same 5-second window. One spotting round. Then silence. Then storm. German defenders who thought they had minutes to escape found themselves annihilated before they could climb from foxholes. A lieutenant from the 116th Panzer Division scrawled in his diary, "The artillery is not a weapon. It is a hand that closes around us. One moment, the field is empty. The next, the world collapses all at once. There is no time to run, no time to think. The hammer never struck alone. As shells fell, American tanks moved. Infantry followed. Fighter bombers screamed down from clouds. This wasn't combined arms in the old sense. It was choreography. Every branch moved to the same rhythm. Every strike reinforced the next. Germans tried to adapt. They shifted positions at night. They dug deeper shelters. They scattered reserves. But each adjustment became another data point fed into the American machine. Patterns were logged, predicted, punished. Within days, entire battalions surrendered without firing shots. To resist was to feed the system. To move was to trigger destruction. To remain still was to be surrounded. What unnerved Germans most wasn't the scale of firepower. It was precision, inevitability. Against Soviets, they faced oceans of men and waves of tanks. Terrifying, yes, but chaos could be exploited. Courage could still carve moments of survival. Against Americans in the Ruhr, there was no chaos, only the ticking of a clock and cold certainty that when your time came, the strike would fall. A German colonel captured near Hamm confessed to interrogators. They don't fight us. They erase us. We cannot defend against a rhythm. We cannot outmaneuver a machine that already knows where we will be. This was innovation not in steel, but in thought. The weapon wasn't a tank or gun, but synchronization itself. War fought like a factory shift, precise to the minute, merciless in its predictability. The Wehrmacht had built a fortress of concrete and courage. Americans brought a storm of process and calculation. In that collision, the old world of battle, where men and will determined fate, was reduced to rubble. Artillery served as the anvil. Armor became the hammer. But blows didn't fall in frontal assaults. American tanks didn't waste themselves storming prepared bunkers. They slid around them. Silent predators searching for gaps. Where German doctrine expected confrontation, Americans delivered absence, appearing where no defense existed, striking where no plan anticipated. April 7th brought reconnaissance reports of a seam southeast of Hamm, barely 4 kilometers wide. Within 3 hours, Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division poured through. Shermans advanced in columns, not against German lines but behind them, cutting arteries, sealing exits, strangling entire divisions before defenders realized the breach was open. For Germans inside the Ruhr, reality twisted into nightmare. Supplies vanished. Radio calls went unanswered. Fuel convoys never arrived. An officer of the 116th Panzer scrawled in despair, "We plan. We move." By the time our orders reach the front, the ground itself has changed. The enemy is already behind us. We fight yesterday's battle while they prepare tomorrow's. This wasn't maneuver warfare as Germans understood it. Tempo became weapon. Every cycle of decision was too slow. Every reaction arrived to meet a battlefield already obsolete. By the time a German commander chose to counterattack, American armor had shifted again. New positions strangled what little initiative remained. German courage still flared. A single Panther tank held an intersection for 6 hours, hammering Shermans until its ammunition burned away. When dust cleared, the Panther stood silent, a blackened husk. Yet the road it guarded had already been bypassed. The sacrifice became meaningless, heroism reduced to a smudge of soot beside the advance. A German staff officer wrote bitterly, "Our bravery achieves nothing. A man can fight like a lion, and the machine simply moves around him. We bleed. They advance. The wheel turns." Americans called it operational tempo. Germans named it Dampfwalze, the steamroller. It wasn't speed in the reckless sense. It was inevitability in motion. Sherman columns didn't charge. They rolled steady as machinery, chewing mile after mile until no escape remained. April 12th brought devastating effects. Isolated pockets realized too late they had been sealed off. Entire battalions found themselves surrounded without ever seeing the enemy face to face. They waited for attacks that never came, until American loudspeakers offered surrender terms. The only choice was to walk out or starve. Intelligence teams listened to the collapse unfold through intercepted German radios. At first, voices were confident, clipped, orderly. Then came confusion, then panic. Finally, resignation. A steady progression from fight to futility. April 13th saw General Harold von Elverfeldt of the 9th Panzer Division report his last counterattack attempt. Every movement is shelled. Every concentration bombed. We advance 500 meters. Enemy armor appears on the flank. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place. 2 days later, he surrendered the remnants of his division, still with 38 operational tanks, still with ammunition for days of combat. He gave up not because he was beaten, but because fighting further meant nothing. German prisoners confessed the same truth to interrogators. Against the Russians, courage could save a man. Against the Americans, courage only meant you died for nothing. That was the cruel genius of the system. It didn't shatter German formations in glorious battle. It smothered them, outpaced them, left them swinging at ghosts while the machine devoured their lifelines. Once despair set in, surrender spread like contagion. April 16th saw more than 150,000 Germans already laying down arms. Prisoner cages filled as quickly as they could be erected. Entire processing stations organized like factories. Rifles stacked, names recorded, rations issued. Prisoners marched away in endless columns. Even captivity was efficient. Even defeat was industrialized. The Wehrmacht entered the Ruhr, prepared for a siege. Instead, they faced an enemy that refused to grant them dignity of a final battle. What they confronted was alien to their traditions, something no amount of bravery could undo. The breakthrough wasn't a clash. It was a realization that every foxhole, every barricade, every desperate stand had been stripped of meaning. That war itself had changed. By mid-April, the fortress of the Ruhr no longer fought. It dissolved. Model still sent signals from his field headquarters near Duisburg. Still scribbled orders, but his words carried no weight. Commanders received them, weighed them against reality outside their bunkers, and quietly chose to disobey. The last instructions from Army Group B permitted surrender at unit discretion. It wasn't an order of defiance. It was the quiet dissolution of an entire army. April 17th brought silence spreading across the radios. April 24th saw the final German holdouts fold. What remained wasn't a battlefield, but a harvest. 325,000 prisoners marched in endless columns, boots crunching on spring roads, including stragglers, Luftwaffe detachments, and SS remnants. The total exceeded 500,000. Never before on the Western Front had so many men capitulated in so short a span. The cost to America, just 2,000 dead, 10,000 wounded. Against an enemy force larger than many nations' entire armies, the U.S. Army had bled scarcely a drop. The contrast was shocking. In the east at Kustrin, 200,000 Germans clung to a shrinking pocket until the war's very last week, suffering 150,000 casualties rather than give up. At Breslau, surrounded in the heart of Silesia, defenders fought 2 months against hopeless odds, losing 80% of their strength before surrender. But in the Ruhr, men with full magazines, men with tanks still fueled, men with fortifications intact, simply laid down their arms. They didn't die with banners flying. They marched quietly into captivity. One American officer watching surrender cages overflow wrote, "They came in rivers, not beaten, not starved, just emptied of fight. They stacked their rifles like offerings, eyes dull, hands outstretched for food. It was the strangest victory I have ever seen." Model himself refused that path. A field marshal doesn't surrender. April 21st found him walking into a forest, sitting beneath the trees, raising a pistol to his temple. His aide remembered the last words. "A general does not live to see his armies disgraced." The shot echoed, final and futile. His soldiers, meanwhile, streamed into captivity by the hundreds of thousands. This was the true consequence of the Ruhr. Not the destruction of German steel, but the collapse of German faith. Soldiers who had fought with fanatical endurance in Russia now surrendered without firing shots in the West. They hadn't been broken in battle. They had been made irrelevant. Eisenhower reported to the Joint Chiefs in measured words that concealed the revolution he had witnessed. The Ruhr campaign demonstrates that modern war, properly applied, can achieve decisive results with minimal loss to our own forces. The key lies in systematic integration of all arms, operating at a tempo which denies the enemy effective response. In truth, the Ruhr was the death certificate of the old way of war. It declared that courage, initiative, and tactical brilliance, qualities that had defined warriors for centuries, were no longer decisive. When faced with a system that processed battle like industry, even the bravest became obsolete. The German soldat had been captured. Soldiers told interrogators, "We did not surrender because we were cowards. We surrendered because fighting was pointless." Every act was answered. Every move was punished. Every defense was bypassed. Why should we die when nothing we did mattered? The Ruhr wasn't remembered for a climactic clash or heroic stand. It was remembered for the silence that followed, for the image of endless lines of German soldiers shuffling west under guard, their weapons abandoned in towering piles. It was the moment war shifted forever, from contests of men to contests of systems, from will to process, from courage to calculation. In that valley of steel and smoke, 500,000 men learned the cruelest truth of the modern battlefield. Survival was the only choice left when resistance had lost all meaning.